Good morning, everyone. I'm Ramia Rasook, Associate Director for Research at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. And on behalf of all of us here at the Crown Center, welcome to today's seminar. Today, we'll explore the forgotten history of labor activism in the oil fields of the Arabian Peninsula and how this labor movement was gradually dismantled as changing ideas of citizenship, rights, and national security reshaped the Gulf's oil economies. Our speaker, Dr. Andrea Wright, is class of 1952 Distinguished Associate Professor of Anthropology in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the College of William and Mary. Her research examines histories of capitalism in South Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and globally to better understand how labor, migration, and energy production shape economies, geopolitical dynamics, and social inequalities. Dr. Wright's first book, Between Dreams and Ghosts, Indian Migration and Middle Eastern Oil, was published by Stanford University Press in 2021, and it's an ethnography of Indian migrants to oil and gas projects in the Gulf. And her second book, the subject of today's seminar, is Unruly Labor, A History of Oil in the Arabian Sea, published by Stanford University Press in 2024. And this explores strikes at oil projects in Iran, the Arabian Peninsula, from 1930 to 1970, a period that includes the end of formal British colonialism and imperialism in the Gulf and South Asia, and the development of new state governments in both of those areas. She'll be in conversation with Dr. Noora Lori, who is the Associate Professor of International Relations at the Frederick Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, where she's also the Director of the Middle East North Africa Initiative and the Provost Faculty Fellow for Graduate Academic Programs. Her research broadly focuses on citizenship, migration, and statelessness. And her first book, Offshore Citizens' Permanent Temporary Status in the Gulf, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, looks at temporal strategies of migration enforcement, citizenship regimes, and naturalization policies, and racial hierarchies in the Persian Gulf region. Her work has also been published in the International Migration Review, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, the Journal of Global Security Studies, Ethnic and Racial Studies, International Relations, and many kind of other volumes and journals. She was previously an Academy Scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies, a Fellow at the International Security Program of the Harvard Kennedy School, and a Visiting Scholar at the Dubai School of Government, and also a former Goldman Faculty Leave Fellow here at the Crown Center. We're very happy to welcome her back, and we're very happy to have both of you here today. Thank you so much. Just a quick note before we begin, today's seminar is being recorded and will be available afterward on the Crown Center's website and YouTube channel. Dr. Wright will begin with about 10 minutes of opening remarks, followed by a 30-minute conversation between her and Dr. Lori, and we'll leave time at the end for audience Q&A. So please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box at any time during the session. And with that, I'm very happy and delighted to turn it over to Dr. Wright.
Well, thank you, Ramiro, for this introduction, and thank you for Noora for agreeing to serve as a discussant. I'm sharing my screen, I hope is okay, great, awesome. So what I wanted to do in this 10-minute introduction is just to tell you about why I wrote this book, as well as some of the key findings from the book. Today, laborers in the Gulf face challenging conditions. And this is something that I write about quite a bit in my first book, Between Dreams and Ghosts, which, as Ramir said, is an ethnography of Indian labor migration to work in the oil fields of the Arabian Peninsula. And this book looks at both the process of migration as well as the experiences of workers while living in the Gulf. And I think we're all familiar with this. It came up probably most recently around the World Cup in Qatar, where there were numerous news articles or statements from places like Human Rights Watch about the abuses that workers suffered in the Gulf. And a lot of this has to do with labor laws that favor employers and restrictions on workers' abilities to unionize and strike. And so these conditions informed the questions that I ask in Unruly Labor, because often when people talk about why are labor conditions the way they are, there's a few reasons. People say it has to do with the resource curse or a problem about how oil wealth hinders or doesn't allow for certain democratic policies to form. People often attribute it to unchanging Gulf Arab traditions, which is uh, problematic because it tends to freeze ideas of the Gulf into the past and weighs tradition too heavily. Uh, People have attributed it to economic reasons like supply and demand or scarcity and surplus. So, because the Gulf has a lot of money and oil, but few workers, and India has a lot of workers, but less money, it makes sense that there would be many workers who go and have poorer conditions. And then most recently, Timothy Mitchell has written Carbon Democracy about how the materiality of oil impacts the ability of workers to organize. And this has a lot of strong points, but historically, we know that workers did go on strikes in the Gulf and that these strikes were at times politically effective. So I wanted to know what happened. And to answer this in Unruly Labor, I look at the relationships among oil companies, local and imperial governments, and workers from the 1930s to 1971. And in each chapter, I begin with a strike. I see how workers move from striking broadly and collectively in places like Bahrain in 1938 and Abidan in Iran in 1946 to solidarities that are increasingly fractured along nationality lines and class lines. The context for this book is the Arabian Sea, which has been, a site of circulation, movement, exchange, and trade, religious exchange for centuries. Um, but in the 20th century in the Arabian Sea, we see the British are a colonial power. They're both the formal colonial rulers of India, British India, which later becomes Indian Pakistan. They have protectorate status with many of the Gulf states, some until 1971, and then they have influence in Iran as well. But the British aren't the only imperial players. There's also the United States, which is increasingly exerting uh, influence in the region. And of course, the USSR after World War II is also exerting influence. Another part of this context is that historically, workers were not just like today, most laborers are from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. But historically, laborers were often Gulf Arabs as well as people from Iran, other areas of the Middle East, and South Asia. In what we know, one of the questions I had in the book is why does this shift? Why are workers now only really from South Asia and the Philippines? Third, one thing I wanted to mention was why did workers strike? And in their strikes, they complain about horrible working and living conditions. They don't have access to clean water. Latrines are open and next to their houses. The home housing is like shanty towns. They also complain of racist treatment. Uh, they go on strike because of massive layoffs. The oil industry is unique in that it takes perhaps 10,000 workers to build an oil refinery, but only 100 workers to run an oil refinery. And they also went on strike because of nationalist ideas and anti-imperialist ideas. But many of these issues were common to all workers. So why was this fracturing happening along national lines increasingly during the period? And I have three key factors that I'm going to briefly mention here, and then I'll probably go into hopefully more detail with Noora. Um, so the first one is that this is a period of changing understandings of citizenship. And the reason I'm showing you the refinery in Aden and is that in 1952, something really exciting happened there. What we see is that every single Indian worker who was working at the refinery to build the refinery went on strike. And this was Indians who were in upper levels of management, who were doctors, who were chemists, so skilled trained professionals, Indians who worked as domestic workers, day laborers, as well as technical journeymen or artisans. Every single one went on strike. And there's a few reasons for this. One is that we see India's independence from British colonial rule in 1947. And in this moment, Indians are able to appeal to the Indian government to help protect their rights. We also see, however, that oil companies are implementing, and if we see here, this looks very neat, but oil companies are also increasingly implementing policies that involve racial segregation and or segregation based on a person's nationality, both in how people live and in the types of jobs they have. So what we see in Aden is that workers are living in different camps based on their nationality, and they tend not to work together. And this is a shift from earlier in other places where workers often lived closer together in close proximity and also worked in close proximity with each other. And it's not only India's independence that's shifting, is also we see changing nationality laws in the Gulf, also shifting how people understand belonging and how belonging actually has who is a citizen has different rights. So there's one example I talk about in the book is that Kuwaiti nationality law changes from a more expansive law in 1948 to a much more restrictive law in the 1950s. And accompanying these changing nationality laws is we see labor laws that also uh, differentiate by giving nationals versus non-nationals different rights and different abilities to do things like strike. So these ideas of nationalism and nationality work in conjunction with the racialization of workers that's happening at oil companies to increasingly segregate workers. And then the third reason is that this is a period in which oil is increasingly connected to national security. And this is both by local governments as well as imperial governments, for example, the British or the US government. And what this leads to is militarized responses to strikes, as happens in Abu Dhabi in the 1960s. And related to this are changing models of profit sharing between oil companies and governments, as well as understandings of oil's importance, not just for military might, but also in manufacturing and in the economy. So those are some of the main points from the book. And then I'm excited to talk more about this with Noora. I'm going to stop sharing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrea. And it's really challenging to bring together a really rich book in 10 minutes of an intro. So thank you for doing that. And I just want to, as a note to the audience, and can see, we have a large audience. Please feel free to start submitting questions in the Q&A chat. That will also give me a sense if I see a lot of questions to wrap up a bit earlier. Currently, the plan is to ask questions for about half an hour and then open it up to a larger discussion. So first, Andrea, thank you for writing this book. It was honestly such a pleasure to read. I learned so much, even though I would have thought that this is material I'm more familiar with. I learned a lot about Bahrain, where I'm from, and it really was kind of a reminder of how repressed this history of labor movements and labor strikes has been. And perhaps predictably, the parts of the book I'm most excited about are questions around citizenship and the rights of non-citizens and citizens here, and how that's connected to the consolidation of this power in this oil industry. But I want to actually just take a step back and ask you about this trajectory from the first to the second book, especially as an anthropologist, thinking about something more historical. And it's interesting, I just read and reviewed Alice Walker's Afterlives of Revolution, which I'm not sure, I don't know if you've gotten a chance to look at. And she's looking at a similar time period a little bit, but the contemporary imprint of these earlier kind of labor movements. But when you read that book, it really feels like that's a work of an anthropologist. It's rather than really something that is deeply, deeply archival. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit about this transition towards a different kind of method. Did you feel like this just sort of intuitively came to you as part of already your anthropological training, or did it feel like being a grad student again to have to learn new skills? And in particular, I wonder how you feel like your training as an anthropologist impacted your reading of these records in the book, and the intro of the book in particular, and throughout, you really show how like these racialized tropes, indeed unruly labor, was kind of littered in the archives themselves. And so how does I think the instinct is to actually read the written record as like the historical accurate record, and you kind of read against the grain. So I just wanted to open up that space about method and kind of process.
Thank you. So my training was in anthropology and history. I did a joint PhD at the University of Michigan, which I was fantastic, and I think it gave me an opportunity to, begin to work in both of those. It's a lifelong process, I think, of, honing one's craft. But so my dissertation actually had some archival materials as well as some ethnographic materials. And I think one of the benefits, there's a few, I mean, I think there's some really exciting things about thinking about anthropology and history together. For anthropology, it helps us understand like the longer house structures that, are so prevalent today came to be. But, for historians, thinking about like the process by which categories are formed, and how these categories are always arbitrary are, I think, really useful. Like when looking at archives, like you said about like these tropes. There's also tropes about, strikes. There's some ways in which strikes are always understood. Like they're always seen as being influenced from outside and not being political, even when workers are saying, we want to vote, we want, political rights. And so I think that like recognizing, like trying to read an archive with a ethnographic eye, I think is helpful. I also think that the use of anthropology and history, because it's interdisciplinary, also encouraged me or gave me some space to think interregionally. So like I think often we think of South Asia and the Middle East as being separate, or in their histories are read separately. And so part of the work I'm trying to think about here is, how can we see this as a, larger whole? Like, how can we question these regional boundaries as well as state boundaries? So,
Thank you. I actually have a question about kind of the international relations and sort of citizenship laws in India, but just to sort of follow the thread of, the motivation behind the book. And I think even for those of us who've been looking for this history, it's really kind of hard to find. I just, we'll talk about kind of the central argument which you've laid out, and how you map out, the construction of the non-citizenship boundary and why labor solidarity kind of fractured over time. Could you start by telling us, about a moment in the archive, an encounter, a document, a strike narrative, that really kind of crystallized the need for this book and made it, was there like an aha moment, a smoking gun or something that really sort of pushed you to say, look, there's an argument, there's a story here that hasn't been told?
one of the, I would say, aha moments or moments that I found most exciting was early in my research when I was in the Indian National Archives in New Delhi. And I was reading through some end of, some documents from the mid 1940s. And what I realized was how many Indians, what these documents made clear to me was how many Indians actually were participating in these 1946 strikes that happened in Abidan. So when we think about the strikes in Abidan in 1946 in Iran, at the time, one of the largest strikes in Middle Eastern history. I mean, it's just huge numbers of workers striking. And often the ways I had read about it was, really framed through the lens of Iranian nationalism, and so I was just thrilled. And the reason I found out about this is because the British is a colonial power in India until 1947. So they had sent spies, or they'd sent, agents to go and follow these Indians who had been striking in Abidan, who were returned to their homes in what are today India and Pakistan, and to make sure that they weren't spreading anti-British ideas and that they weren't spreading communist ideas. And so this was like this, late like colonial project that's going on. And I had just no idea that there have been so many and that it was such a concern at the time. And so that really opened my eyes to these solidarities and strikes. And then I began to look for other moments of like solidarity and moments where we see people who are going on strike from multiple nationalities and multiple languages or religions and things like that.
Wonderful. Actually, that is really connected to my next question, which was, now we see the Gulf labor regimes and the division of labor by nationality as being sort of fixed or inevitable, connected again to oil, but also a lot of the tropes that you opened up with. And I think what this is also sort of practiced in the way that minimum wage levels, for example, for the same job are different based on which national origin you have, and this is structured and legal. And the economists have a nice way of, depoliticizing that by talking about the reservation wage and people's worth is kind of connected to this nationality. You're looking at moments in before even some of these citizenship regimes are consolidated, and I think your discussion just now about India and like what's happening with the partition of India. I also think about work like Neha Vora's, who helps us establish that how deep the ties are between India and the Gulf, and the fact that we kind of count people as temporary who've been there over generations, in some cases prior to the partition of India. And so kind of going to this like division of labor by nationality, I think the question is, what surprised you most about the moments where solidarities did hold across national lines? And you talk a little bit about some of these strikes in the 1930s and 40s, where there was a solidarity. And I wonder if you could just expand upon that for people who haven't read the book. I'm thinking Bahrainis, Indians, Palestinians, others. At what conditions made these early solidarities possible? And then, what ultimately fractured them. But what did you learn about these early kind of cross-national solidarities?
So I think in the book I talk about mostly in 1938 in Bahrain, 1946 in Abidan, and then I talk about 1946 also in Kuwait as three moments where I see these intergroup international solidarities. And some of them are informed by communist ideologies, particularly in Abidan. And then there's a number of other strikes that are informed by some communist ideologies in the Gulf that I don't go into as much, but that I mention. And they are, so that's one motivator. I think another really big motivator is that in Abidan in 1946 or in Bahrain in 1938, workers are all living together. They all have the same poor living conditions. Abidan, they're described by managers of the oil company as being urine-tainted squalor. They're all overcrowded. They are plywood. They don't protect from the heat or the cold. It's really horrible conditions, and they work together. And I think it's this proximity and of everyday lives that really helps foster the solidarities. There's also, I believe, ideological commitments and a familiarity that emerges in other ways too. So there's two moments in the book that I talk about, but don't unpack a lot. And these are in 1948, when with the partition of Palestine, Indian workers are also participate in strikes and protests in Bahrain. We know against this partition plan, and they're really upset about it. And we also see, like in 1963 in Qatar, when the United Arab Republic is announced, that Indian workers also go to celebrate with this and are excited about this development. So there's anti perhaps anti-imperial or nationalist sentiments that are also anti-colonial sentiments that are also motivating workers' actions in these moments. And so I think one of the biggest things are these shared living and working conditions, but there's also these like shared beliefs in self-determination that are influencing worker action.
Wonderful. Actually, and so this is now connected to how this kind of divide and conquer and fracturing. And what you said was, look, that some of these, when you have this proximity, when you see, when you're living through these same kind of conditions, then it can, lead to solidarity. And when you start allocating different kinds of rights and different kinds of conditions for different groups, then this also can kind of, fracture a sense of solidarity. I think a lot about the Gulf and actually talking to like my grandmother's generation uh, that who's reminding us that domestic workers used to be other people from the Gulf, that like there's this kind of way in which a certain kind of labor has been very racialized as needing to come from Asia, and you show how this really is a shift that happens with an eye to these strikes. And so I think maybe, for people who haven't read the book, I was, some of the very concrete, granular management practices that are really racialized and about kind of creating different conditions for different workers based on their national origin was really fascinating. I think it has resonances which, you reference from, the way that Jim Crow gets exported. I'm thinking also of Vitalis's work, but you really go into some of these concrete details, and I wonder if you could share some of that with us.
So, Robert Vitalis's work on America's Kingdom, of course, talks a lot about how U.S. managers like import Jim Crow ideas about segregation, particularly at Aramco and there. And these, as other oil companies are beginning new projects and building labor camps, this idea of segregating workers becomes like increasingly important. It helps managers recognized in 1946 in the Abidan, both managers in Iran, but also managers from who are looking at it, recognize that workers living together was, part of this problem. And so there's really this desire to keep workers separate. And as workers are kept like spatially separate, really far from each other, this is enforced by police and security and enforcing the space between, and they're given at like recreational activities are given different. You only have a certain time based on your nationality to do these activities, and they give different nationalities like different benefits. So for example, they might give Indians an extra might have an extra night where they're able to access the bar, but Pakistanis would be given an extra day where they're able to use the cricket fields, and Lebanese might be given an extra night at the cinema. And this like differentiation base of like leisurely activities actually really creates a lot of infighting amongst workers because they're, people are like, well, why don't we get an extra day at the bar? Well, why do they get, and so this instead of seeing themselves, like instead of because they're not working together and they're not living together and they're being differentiated based on their nationality, they're able to they also, start to feel competition. And then, of course, they begin to pay differently based on nationality. And there's a lot of, this is when the oil companies are really working through how do we defend these pay scales that both workers complain about, that they're different based on nationality, but also, different governments complain about. So both like the Indian government, but also, the local governments in the Arabian Peninsula complain about why are people paid differently. And so um, it these differences I help of course create profit for the oil companies as you pay workers differently and it creates fewer strikes. Oh, I think you're muted.
Reminds me of Zoom teaching. So here we go. Yeah, I think you've sort of, I want to kind of transition from thinking about national sort of about the migrant workers and say a little bit, invite you to say a little bit more about the way in which this oil industry impacts the construction of citizenship rights in the Gulf. And I think, the familiar story is that the way that oil influences citizenship is behavioral, that somehow like getting this money, these subsidies changes people's political preferences. And so it's a behavioral story about the money that comes from oil. I think you're telling one that is much more kind of institutional and structural about how these citizenship laws get constructed. And so I wonder if you would be willing to walk us through a bit of a specific case. You mentioned Kuwait initially, Bahrain, Saudi, where changes in citizenship law directly reshaped worker organizing. And this was something I also saw in the archives on the UAE, and in particular, one thing that kind of was salient for me is this term that Elizabeth Cohen terms of like countdown deadlines, and these are deadlines that are constitutionally constructed as this is the time of the founding of the state. And so in the case of the UAE, this is 1925, even though the state doesn't consolidate until 1971, but you have to connect your tribal lineage to these and your family books to these founding tribes of 1925. And in the British archives, it's noted that, this is because it's before oil is discovered, so it prevents people from, instrumentally making claims towards citizenship. So I've seen it in different ways in the way that oil kind of comes up, but you're actually talking about the oil companies themselves, like the corporations that are part of this governance. And I think that was really fascinating for me because a lot of the citizenship literature is extremely state-centric, and you're bringing in actually corporations also play a role here, not just on migrant workers, right, but it's also thinking about how these citizenship regimes get consolidated. So I just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit more about that construction of the citizen non-citizen boundary insofar as it impacts citizens from these Gulf states.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to think through. But one example, again, is if we go to Kuwait, is that if we look at the 1948 law, it's pretty expansive, and who can claim to be a national, and the later law in late 50s, early 60s is much more strict. But it's not. In the story about Kuwait is often that there's a lot of pressure from Kuwaitis to restrict who can have access, and this is the same in Qatar. It's the same in Abu Dhabi. It's happening throughout the Gulf. But what we see is that the concessions that oil companies signed with the rulers of the Arabian Peninsula specify that they need to hire workers from either they have to hire locals or nationals of the area, or they have to hire often people from India because Indians are seen as being um, less problematic in some ways, which we could go into in a different moment. But so this means that they need to hire nationals, and the oil companies recognize that nationals are able to make requests on the local ruler that other workers are not necessarily able to effectively make. And so the oil companies, like in 1948 in Kuwait, are just beside themselves because everyone's just getting a nationality certificate. And this happens also in Bahrain, and this happens in Qatar, at Abu Dhabi. And, they're really pressure the government to be very restrictive in who is a national of the area so that they can both decide who to hire, but because of these differential wage scales, who they can pay differently. And then when they're done with a project and need to release workers, who they can fire. So again, because you need so many fewer workers when you're for different phases of the oil industry, there's, always an issue of redundancy. So the Kuwait Oil Company has like 15,000 workers and they want to reduce it to 5,000, and they're worried about both. They don't want to fire Kuwaitis because both the Kuwaiti government doesn't want them to, but also because they're worried they can't deport Kuwaitis if like you can deport workers who go on strike or if they're no longer working, but you can't deport citizens. And so who is a citizen, and the difference between a citizen and a non or a national and a non-national becomes increasingly important, and oil companies are really driving that differentiation.
I see we actually have already some questions in the chat, so I'm going to try to consolidate a few of my questions. And so maybe let's make sure that people get a big part of the main argument, and then I have some follow-ups. You argue that this securitization transformed the reading of these strikes from labor grievances to national security threats. And I think that's a really important kind of transition that actually we're seeing globally, where migration is kind of seen as this national security threat, and or labor movements. What can is there a moment when this shift becomes especially stark? Can you say something about this shift from seeing this as, just a question of like labor practices of a particular government to a national security, sorry, of a particular company, to now this is a national security threat?
So I think that from the beginning of the oil industry in the Gulf, it was connected to militarization. So in 1908, the oil is discovered in Iran, and shortly thereafter, the British changed their navy to oil powered. Um, and by the mid 20th century, every navy in the world is oil powered. Like, which allows ships to go faster and farther, and it's seen as a military thing. So there's always some connection between security and oil. Um, but what happens is in 1951 in Iran, oil is nationalized, and this at the time is uh, a huge blow to the British because Abidan, the refinery in Abidan, was like the largest British investment outside of the UK at the time, and it was also one of the main sources of oil. And in response to the nationalization from 1951 to 1953, we see an embargo on Iranian oil. A few years later, in Bahrain, which has one of the uh, is both one of the biggest refineries in the Gulf at the time, and we see also a lot of political unrest. And in the UK, when government officials are discussing this, they're very explicit that they are worried that the UK can't afford another embargo, even though it's just a few years later, because UK industry, as well as the armed forces, are so reliant on oil. And so oil becomes not only important for the military, but also because of these uh, its uses in industry and its association with like progress and development. And it's actually has so many industrial uses. So there's that. But then also there's issues in the 1960s, for example, in Abu Dhabi, when workers go on strike, there's both the British are confronted with a few, and the oil companies are confronted with a few issues. One is that workers are going on strike, they're making political claims, and when they call in the police, these are Abu Dhabi workers, when they call in the police do one of two things. One is that they greet the workers, they rub noses, and then they stand aside and let the workers strike. The second is they greet the workers, they rub noses, and they join in the strike with the workers. So neither of these are great. And the oil companies and the British government are concerned about this. And eventually they have to bring in the British military or the Navy to a threat of the British Navy to like stop the strikes. But they see this within a context of growing nationalization of oil resources that's happening. There, again, the importance of oil for military, but also industry, and you know, other decolonizing processes that are happening. So I think it's this convergence of actions that really shift this reading of oil from being about workers striking to being about national security, because oil is just seen to be so tied into both the security not only of the local governments but also to imperial government stability.
And that's, I'm going to wrap up. This is my final question. I have others, but I see that actually some of the Q&A is actually getting at some of these questions. But taking kind of going back to the point about your aha moment where you're seeing, these tentacles across regions, right? I was struck in your book and about a few of these passing comments in the archives of desires for stateless workers, like these have the least number of rights, so they're the best to kind of invest in. With this kind of differentiation of workers and what kinds of rights they have, are there places where you saw sending states play a role in protecting workers' rights? And I'm thinking now, I know like the Filipino government has a whole overseas workers ministry. Do you have examples where it felt like actually it makes a difference whether you're a migrant worker or a stateless worker, because the stateless person doesn't have an authority to vouch for you and say this person belongs, it's under my jurisdiction, they have rights, diplomatic and otherwise. Does it make a difference? Do migrant workers who actually have secure citizenship status elsewhere, were they able to sort of get that support from some of the sending countries? Or did you see the opposite? Did you see that there's a real financial incentive in keeping these workers going and getting these remittances in, and less of a concern about, are these worker conditions?
I mean, I think this is a great question because of course, this sending states, if they support their workers or not, has also to do with like who the workers are who's striking. So one example I talk about in the book is in 1948, a group of Indian chemists, so people who are highly educated, who are all Hindus, who come from different parts of India, but are, all, again, very educated, high caste people, are are upset because they're fired, and they think they're being fired because of racism at the Bahrain Petroleum Company. And what happens is the Indian government, really steps in and pressures the company. And also in 1953 in Aden, when we see all the Indians striking, eventually the Indian government actually halts the emigration of Indians to that project until some changes are made to the food in particular that's given to workers, which is one of the workers' main demands. And this stopping of the workers is like huge, because we're like these are thousands and thousands of workers that are coming and that are have experience also in the oil industry and are really wanted. So this really is something that the oil company managers are very aware of, and they're also aware of the benefits of stateless workers. So they're very explicit in this moment in the mid 1950s when the British petroleum managers are concerned about the Indian workers striking and the consequences of this, they write to Aramco, and Aramco writes back and they say, it's great, you should hire Palestinians. Palestinians have no rights, they have no one to defend them. The only person who will take care of them is the government, so they don't strike at all. They used to strike, but they don't anymore. And so they're very clear on this differentiation between people who are citizens somewhere and that can make those claims on a state and have that responded to, and then people who are stateless or yeah, stateless. And so another group is Italians from Eritrea, which is also seen as stateless or not having these rights following World War II. So um, yeah, it's really fascinating how these claims of citizenship can work, but then at the same time, like minority communities, people who come from minority communities in India are not always as successful at making these claims and having the government listen or take up their cause. So it's not every citizen isn't necessarily treated the same way by the ascending state.
And actually, so there are two questions that dovetail from the Q&A. I'm going to uh, transition to that. The first question is from Nasser Masri. Hi, Nasser. Thanks for joining. He says he's very excited to read this book. In places like Aden, Aleppo, and elsewhere, cities were made up of a range of ethnic and religious groups. In Aden, there were Indians, Muslims, and Hindus, Somalis, Arabs, Europeans, some of which were considered Adeni and some not. How did the divides or lack thereof between Indians shape protest? Similarly, how did their relations to others in Aden and the growing cross-ethnic political organizations shape or interact with the protests and protesters? And actually, there's a second question by Bruce Stanley. Thank you, Bruce, who says, so many of the quote unquote Indians in the Gulf today are Keralites, Malays, sorry if I'm butchering that, especially in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Can you please break down the Indian into the Malays in the period that you're looking at for labor strikes? Sorry, how, let me start that question again. Can you please break down quote Indian into how the Malays in the period you were looking at for labor strikes might have acted differently? And so I think both of these questions are asking about sort of divisions within some of these national origin categories.
And these are both awesome and fascinating questions. One of the things about Aden is that the where workers are living is not near the city at all. They're really far away. And in fact, they're so far away that they have trouble going to the city to meet with the Indian commissioner to like give their complaints. And it's one of their things that they complain about is that they're just so remote that they're basically in a camp that's not closely connected. And that's I think this separation is, I mean, it's something we see still today in the Gulf, but it, helps also isolate. So I mean, so at the same time that there's Indian workers are, uh, striking, another issue that's coming up is that there's elections in Aden, and there's like some debates over if like an Indian or person who's Indian or background is Indian should be able to like stand in those elections. So there's also we see understandings of like citizenship, ethnicity, being more meant being discussed and negotiated in some ways. Ideas of ethnicity and nationality being the same um, are cementing in some ways, but what's happening with the workers is that they're actually quite far from the city. In contrast, local workers have many more connections to the city and actually are much more effective when they strike because of these connections and their ability to draw connections. Um, and regarding the question about so many Indians and Malayalams, there's two things. One is my I read Hindi and Urdu. I don't read Malayalam, so there's a little bit of a gap in my archival resources there. But a lot of the Indians, it's surprising because and I was also surprised that a lot of the Indians who are going in the 40s and 50s and 60s, many of them are from the Punjab, and which is not an area. I mean, there are many Punjabis in the Gulf today, but it's, it's part of British India and it's partitioned into India and Pakistan in 47. So there's a lot of workers who are coming from that region. There's also, of course, people from uh, Bengal and let's say Bangladesh also there. Um, and it's interesting because we see the rise in Malayalams. I think like migration to the Gulf, I believe, is a little bit later. But now, today, again, most laborers in the Gulf actually are from northern India because oil companies prefer to hire um, workers who will take the lowest wages. And so people from Kerala and want higher wages to be laborers, not I'm speaking about like manual laborers. So they go to today, and I think for the past about 20 years, most laborers come from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which are Jharkhand, some of the most economically depressed states in India. So there's some movement in that. Although, of course, there are Malayalams working in the Gulf at the time. I have a little bit of a gap about all of that, I guess. And Goans, there's many Goans, but Goa's history in India is slightly different.
Thank you, Andrea. And actually, that response just reminded me that I didn't actually ask you just a simple question of like, can you say something about the different data sources? Because this is multilingual archival. So do just like in a sentence, and then we actually have more questions that I'll pose your way from the audience.
Right. So the archival sources are many, many in English, also in Arabic, Urdu, and Hindi. I used the Indian National Archive, some archives in the Gulf, the British Petroleum's Archive, the National Archive of the UK, Hoover Institute, and then there's like an oral history collection at the University of North Texas, of Caltech. So it's a very eclectic gathering, and also sources that people have shared with me over the time I've been working on the project. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Our next question is from Gabriel Young. Thank you, Gabriel. Andrea, I appreciate your work in helping me understand how the UN, as a reference point for Indian workers in the Gulf after 1947, functioned in important ways as a post-colonial institution. Usually we think of it in terms of the post-World War II liberal international order, etc. Regarding oil worker organizing, can you tell us more whether wage increases were the most common strike demand that you encountered, and if not, what explains variation in worker demands?
So that's interesting. I think wages are certainly an issue. Other issues, though, I mean, it depends. Some of it has to do with, of course, self-determination, frustration with seeing oil companies as being part of an imperialist project. But there's a lot of complaints about living conditions, access to clean water, access to cold water, not having fans. There's also a lot of strikes related to like working conditions, including not having proper ventilation in places where people are exposed to noxious fumes. And I would say, perhaps in addition to living conditions, uh, upset with racist treatment comes up over and over and over again. And it's not just, I mean, it's like in multiple groups complain of this. They complain of being, treated with racism. They complain of being, having, derogatory terms used about them. They complain about being hit by managers, or, I mean, there's a lot of issues around what workers call racist treatment. And interesting because workers also at times refer to like issues in the United States. So like even Saudi workers refer to the civil rights movement in the United States when they're making some other complaints about their treatment. And Pakistani workers talk about the treatment of African Americans in the United States is, like their positions being similar. And so there's these in Indians as well. Like, so there's these ways in which people are identifying, um, and they're identifying racist treatment, and there's a way in which race and nationality are being conflated and understood as one.
Wonderful. And actually, the next question is, I think, asks us to sort of think beyond the resistance frame, or maybe show variation in responses to the oil companies and colonial powers. And it made me really think about, sometimes when it comes to the Gulf, there's really this uh, foregone conclusion that uh, act, everyday actions must be political, and they must be sort of forms of resistance, because that is the default and only possible response in an authoritarian setting. And I think you see this, of course, with like quantitative studies that use these large end data sets where, all of the Gulf states are like -10, not free for decades, right? And so there's no variation in that story. And sometimes ethnographic work can fall into the same trap when it's sort of like because of the kind of censorship and self-censorship, there's a tendency to sort of read everyday actions as it must be political, even if they're just sort of daily actions. In this case, you're actually talking about strikes, but I think I'm going to transition to the question from Bernard Haeckel, who's asking about sort of variation in responses to both these foreign powers and the presence of oil companies. So he writes, "Hi, Bernie, thanks for coming. How do you explain the difference between how Iranians feel about BP and the British, and how Saudis positively perceive the American oil and service companies, as can be seen from the continued collaboration between Saudi Aramco and the US oil executives and companies?" And then the second question is, how does a Cold War fit into your narrative? And actually, when I saw that, that was one of the questions I sort of was also going to pose. So maybe we can actually take those two as separate. So the first one, this, yeah,
Yeah,
distinction.
no, thank you. I think that it's a really rich question, and it's really interesting because there is always this like desire to see resistance, but then there's also this way to, I think we want to sometimes, or at least when we read the archive, things are like heavily depoliticized, and so it's there's a balancing act there. But thinking about Iranians and British Petroleum and Saudis and Aramco, it's interesting because I think if we look historically, Iranians made really wanted more training. And this is a claim that's made throughout the, Gulf, Persian Gulf. Workers want more training, they want better positions, they want to advance. And there was some movement, but it's not very successful in British Petroleum. And then, of course, after 1953, British Petroleum, there's multiple oil interests operating in Iran, so it's not exactly the same. Whereas I think Saudi Aramco, well, so Aramco before it's really does do some work to train workers, as do some other areas, and even British Petroleum, as it's like operating in Abu Dhabi, begins trying to train workers. But what happens with British Petroleum in Abu Dhabi is it soon decides that it's going to contract out most of its labor. Uh, there's this shift in the 60s where they decide that have most of they're going to contract out most of the labor management or different parts of the job. And so with this decision to contract out, and it really stalls any training because contractors are less invested in training. And this is different than in Saudi Arabia, where Aramco maintains that tie. And, of course, in Aramco, there's a lot of debates over if they should put that much investment in. And it's also kind of questionable how much training is actually effective and how much people are advancing versus, PR being put out that there is. So there's, I think the different histories in some ways, I mean, the different views in some ways might be our presentist views of how like the relationship trend, how Aramco now looks, like as part of Saudi Aramco versus what happened in Iran. I think it might have some of the ways that we see it is very different, but I think at the time, workers had the same complaints. They wanted that training, they wanted better paying jobs, and they wanted more skills. They wanted to they didn't want just more pay, but they wanted to learn how to do these jobs so that they could advance in the industry. Um, so that's a rambling answer to that. But the Cold War is, huge because it's both, as the Cold War is ramping up, of course, it plays into the securitization. The British are worried about Americans exerting too much influence. They're worried about the USSR exerting too much influence. Americans are upset about the British and the USSR. And we also see that a lot of strikes, a really effective way to stop stop strikes and to criminalize the strikers is by labeling those strikes as communist. And so that's becomes a way of hampering, labor movements and both hampering certain types of political parties or political organizing, but also just a way of hindering strikes at all because they can just be considered communist. And they would use evidence like someone has a newspaper that was associated with perhaps a communist party, even if it's, you know, it's not necessarily like the communist news, it's just a newspaper that somebody thinks is communist. So there's a lot of ways in which the Cold War and the specter of communism becomes a way to limit workers' rights at the same time that both the oil companies and the British and the UK government are very concerned about competing interests.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question is from Sama Shahata. Thank you, Sama, for joining. When do nationals stop working as quote unquote manual laborers in the oil industry across the Arab Gulf states? And are there any noticeable shifts, labor activism, politics, etc., during these moments?
So in the book, I talk a bit about in the 1960s, I think we start to see fewer, there's still nationals working as laborers, but there's fewer. And there's a few reasons for this. Oil companies are frustrated by the amount, by the salary. They think they have to pay nationals too much, whereas they can hire Indians or Pakistanis much more cheaply. They're worried about the when nationals strike, that they are hard to stop, like they have to call in the military because the police won't do it. And, of course, governments don't want to call in the military on their citizens, but it's much easier to arrest people who are not citizens and to deport them. And so as national security becomes so primary, and because of this racialization that really segments jobs, we see, beginning in the 1960s, but it's a longer process, this real replacement of local workers with or nationals with non-nationals that then just really allows for workers to be deported if they go, be arrested if they go on strike, deported, and it doesn't raise the same issues.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a number of other questions. I also wanted to sneak in one, but I will behave myself and get through the list first. But I realized one of the things you do is each chapter starts with a different Gulf case, and I meant to ask you about variation across these cases. So if we have time, we can come back to that. But let me introduce you to my colleague, Hiba Najada. Actually, I don't know if I mentioned that she taught your book in her class at BU, and I got to be a guest lecturer. So she asked, Hiba, thanks for joining us. Can you say more about the differentiation of spaces and camps? Saleh Al-Hathlul has written about Aramco camps for American workers functioning as spaces of separation from locals, about locals setting up labor camps at the outskirts of oil sites, and about how they come to be turned informal and thereby an object of development. Is this something you looked at, and whether or not local workers' camps became the sites of strikes? And I should say, Hiba is trained in architecture and space and planning, so this is something that's getting at sort of the spatial organization of these companies.
Yeah, no, well, thank you Heather, for teaching the class. It's nice to meet you. Um, I I do look at the how this space plays out, and so, I begin with like if we think about in Abidan in this like 1946, the idea that British Petroleum has is actually that they have separate areas for different people. And and I think back to like Will Glover's work on colonial Lahore, but where he like talks about how like, these colonial separations of space, architecturally are often more in the colonizers' imagination than they are actually play out in practice because people are always like moving between things. Um, and there's a few interesting, I guess, things like, that I think of when I think of your question. One is that, containing workers like from the US or from the UK or other parts of Europe, in some ways, these separations are also because workers from like the US are also seen as being, kind of problematic in different ways. Like they cause problem, like so in not in Saudi Arabia, but in other parts of the Gulf when they're there, they can the British government worries about them breaking law, like they do break laws. And then how do they like? There's issues around jurisdiction, and it causes disruptions. And so there's ways in which having European and American or white managers all living in a place is both kind of controls them as well. Like it keeps them from uh, causing certain types of problems. And then there are also these local camps, which are sometimes they do become sites of political action, and they become even hard to control because often local camps people have their and the managers, oil company managers, write about this quite a bit. They have their families with them. They might have their wives, children, and so there's a lot like which also hinders how people respond to strikes because you're not going to nobody wants to bring in a military to like break up families. And so there's these ideas about who's in the camps, and oil companies really don't are some oil companies are resistant to having like families in the camps and the local workers families in the camps, and others feel like that's how one of the ways in which camps should be organized to make workers happy. And so there's like these debates over that. And a part of it is these like informal spaces that are really different than like the tents that are put up for, migrant workers where they don't have this option of bringing family and, really have their spaces much more controlled. And so there is these variations. Although I'm, in Saudi Arabia, as we know, like the the police do a lot to manage um this to manage the segregation of workers, even local workers, like in camps.
Wonderful, thank you. So the last question is from my student, Tamaris Otesh. Thank you, Tamaris, for coming. Given today's labor system where Gulf states often rely on migrant workers, but because they're also seen as less politically connected or less likely to challenge authority, how do current dynamics shape or limit the possibility of migrant and national workers organizing together, especially if shared problems can arise for both groups? And is there any meaningful solidarity from national workers towards migrants who come through the kafala system and face discrimination?
This is a very rich question. Thank you. I'm thinking about this. One of I think that of course there's moments of like um solidarity and friendship. And I think, one of the sites that I would see this like ethnographically of is in, smaller factories and sites like that. Or like subsidiary factories that supply parts to oil companies is one of the sites I worked in my first book. But I also, if I could flip this slightly into like a project I've been working on, is one of the things I was really interested in is after October of 23, we see huge strikes in India in support of Palestine. And this is interesting because in the Indian government, in particular, areas that are controlled by certain political parties, they make, strikes. I mean, they make protests, in support of Palestine illegal. They make talking about Palestine on social media illegal. They make having a Palestinian flag illegal. I mean, there's, like a lot of oppression. People are being arrested for this, but people are still striking. And I mean, not striking, but they're still protesting and they're still really worked up about it. And it's not just Indian Muslims or Indian communists who are maybe who people would assume would be sympathetic to Palestine, but it's just everyday people who are, from all religious backgrounds. And so I was talking to people that I knew who had worked in the Gulf and Indians who'd worked in the Gulf and who were Hindus and who had moved back to India. And they were talking about how they were active in these protests in support of Palestine. And and I was, like, why are you interested? Because there's no, it's not, I guess it's, you risk being arrested and they're like, but I worked in the Gulf. I learned about Palestinians and, we can't have these, it's unjust. And, that's how, when I met Palestinians, I began to care about them. And
Mm.
I thought that was really fascinating because, you know, we know that migration doesn't always create people, feeling more, uh, create broader solidarities. But in this case, it does. And and so I've been thinking through like what allows for that to happen. And I think it might be like seeing Palestinian history and Indian history is connected in some ways around partition and imperialism, but also just this experience of migrating and talking to people and living together. And so I think that even though the book is thinking about how does this line between national and non-national get drawn, there's many examples of people still, like working across these boundaries, and really collaborating both politically, but also, just in everyday actions, that I think really lend themselves to solidarity.
Wonderful. Um, I'm checking to see if Ramiar is about to turn us off. I was gonna say I didn't see his face, so maybe we have time for more questions, but I think this means we're wrapping up. Thank you, Andrea.
Well, I really don't want to stop, but we are out of time. And thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Noora, so much for this really wonderful kind of conversation and taking us through this kind of history, but then also helping us kind of understand how that history is so relevant to understanding some of the challenging conditions of kind of migrant labor kind of in the region kind of today. I also want to thank our audience for joining us, and to let you know that this is our last seminar of the semester, but we'll be back in January, and we have a full slate of wonderful talks lined up for the spring. And I do want to encourage you to please sign up for our email list if you haven't already, or follow us on your favorite social media platform. We'll begin on January 15th with a panel that's looking at the 15th anniversary of the Arab Spring, bringing in kind of experts from the Arab world to kind of look at kind of the hopes that animated that moment, but also kind of the divergent kind of paths that sort of different countries have taken since, and what those uh, implications are for kind of understanding developments in the region today. But we're also going to have wonderful talks looking at kind of post-revolutionary life in Iran, looking at kind of smuggling kind of and sovereignty in Turkish Kurdish borderlands. We'll be looking at kind of climate change in the Middle East, looking at kind of developments in Syria and Islamic media in Egypt as well. So a really fascinating set of talks. We'll hope you'll join us for those events. And thank you again for being with us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.